Roughly 80% of China's imported crude oil arrives by sea. A large share of it passes through a stretch of water that is, at its narrowest point, about 1.5 nautical miles wide. Chinese strategists have a name for this problem. In 2003, Hu Jintao reportedly described it as the Malacca Dilemma, and it has shaped Chinese planning ever since. In the last video I argued Russia has become the dependent partner in its relationship with Beijing. The obvious follow-up question is the one I want to answer here: what is China dependent on? Because a state with a single maritime choke point in its supply chain is not the unconstrained actor it is often described as. My argument is that China's energy geography imposes real limits on its behavior, that Beijing knows it, and that almost every major Chinese infrastructure project of the last 15 years is an attempt to escape it. By the end you will be able to see which of those escape routes actually work and which are theater. This matters because the entire Western debate about deterrence assumes something about Chinese risk tolerance, and that assumption is rarely examined. If China's economy can be strangled at a single point by a navy it cannot yet match in blue water, then Beijing's appetite for a conflict that triggers a blockade is structurally lower than its rhetoric suggests. If, on the other hand, the overland alternatives have quietly matured, then the choke point is a legacy problem and the deterrence math has already shifted without anyone announcing it. Those two worlds require completely different policies. Getting it wrong in either direction is expensive. China's dependence is a recent condition, not an ancient one. It was a net oil exporter until the early 1990s. Industrialization flipped it, and it flipped hard. Domestic production plateaued around 4 million barrels per day while consumption climbed past 15. The gap is imported, and the overwhelming majority of it arrives by tanker. Look at where it comes from. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Oman, Iran. Every one of those cargoes crosses the Indian Ocean and enters the South China Sea through the same narrow passage. Malacca handles something on the order of a quarter of all seaborne traded oil. It is bordered by Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, none of them Chinese allies, and Singapore hosts a rotational American naval presence. So the vulnerability is not hypothetical. It is a specific stretch of water, controlled by no one friendly, patrolled by a navy that has spent 80 years organizing itself around exactly this kind of leverage. The first response was to build around it, and this is where the argument gets interesting, because the numbers do not match the rhetoric. The China-Myanmar pipeline, opened in 2017, lands crude at Kyaukphyu on the Bay of Bengal and pipes it overland to Yunnan. On a map it looks like a clean solution. It bypasses Malacca entirely. Its design capacity is around 440,000 barrels per day. Against Chinese imports of roughly 11 million barrels per day, that is under 4%, and it has often run below capacity. It also runs through territory contested by armed groups in an ongoing civil conflict. The Central Asian pipelines are more substantial for gas but do not solve crude. The ESPO pipeline from Russia is genuinely significant, and it is the reason the last video matters here. Russian overland supply is the single largest non-maritime source China has. Add every overland route together, Russia, Kazakhstan, Myanmar, and you get somewhere in the range of a quarter of imports at absolute best. 3/4 still comes by sea, and most of that still transits Malacca. The second response was stockpiling. China's strategic petroleum reserve has grown substantially and is deliberately opaque. Public estimates cluster somewhere between 1 and 2 months of import cover, with wide error bars. A month or two of buffer changes the timeline of a crisis. It does not change the outcome of one. Reserves buy negotiating time, they do not buy independence. The second pillar is the one that gets least attention. Escorting the supply line requires a navy China does not yet have. China has built the largest navy in the world by hull count. That statistic is true and it is also misleading. Hull count includes a great many corvettes and coastal vessels optimized for near-seas operations. What protecting a sea lane across the Indian Ocean requires is sustained blue water logistics, replenishment ships, overseas basing, carrier aviation with real endurance. China has been building exactly these, which tells you they understand the problem, but the fleet is not yet configured for sustained operations 5,000 kilometers from home against a pier. Note also who else sits on that route. India operates from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, directly astride the western approach to Malacca. Any Chinese plan to keep the lane open has to account for a second large regional navy that is not aligned with Beijing. This is the part one find most telling. You do not spend 2 decades building overseas port access, replenishment capability, and carrier aviation if you believe your supply lines are safe. The behavior reveals the assessment. The fourth constraint is one that a stockpile cannot address at all, because it is not about the oil, it is about what has to happen to the oil after it arrives. Refineries are built for specific crude grades. The distillation and cracking configuration is tuned to a particular density and sulfur content, and switching a plant to a substantially different feedstock is not a matter of turning a valve. China's refining sector has been built out substantially over 2 decades, and much of it is configured for the medium sour grades that come from the Gulf. That constrains substitution in a way the barrel count arithmetic hides. Replacing a Gulf cargo with a different grade is not one for one, it can mean lower yields of the products actually in demand, or running plants below optimum. And the same applies to the strategic reserve. A reserve holds specific grades. Drawing it down during a disruption means running refineries on whatever is in the tanks, which may not match what they were designed for. So the honest version of the reserve number is not 60 days of imports. It is 60 days of crude, processed through a system optimized for a supply pattern that the disruption just broke. This is why I keep returning to overland supply as the strategically valuable piece. Pipeline crude from Russia and Kazakhstan arrives continuously, in a known grade, to refineries configured for it. That predictability is worth more than the volume suggests, and it is another reason the relationship with Moscow is harder for Beijing to treat casually than the raw dependency numbers imply. The fifth factor is the one that could change this entire picture, and it has nothing to do with ships, the domestic energy mix. Oil is what arrives by sea, but oil is not the majority of Chinese primary energy consumption. Coal, domestically produced, not imported, remains the largest single source, and renewable and nuclear capacity have been added at a pace no other country has matched. That has a specific strategic consequence. Every unit of energy demand that shifts from imported oil to domestic electricity is a unit that does not transit Malacca. Electrification of transport is the mechanism. Chinese electric vehicle adoption has moved faster than most forecasts anticipated, and transport is where oil demand actually lives. A substantial share of crude consumption goes to road fuel. So the build-out that is usually discussed as climate policy or industrial policy is also, and possibly primarily, energy security policy. It attacks the choke point from the demand side rather than the supply side. And unlike a pipeline through Myanmar, it does not depend on any other country's territory or goodwill. This is the strongest argument that the Malacca constraint is time-limited rather than permanent, and I want to give it full weight because it cuts against my own thesis. If oil demand plateaus and then declines while domestic generation grows, the choke point's leverage decays on its own, no navy required, no pipeline built, no negotiation with anyone. Here is the strongest version of the opposing case, and I think it is stronger than it usually gets credit for. The argument is that a blockade of China is close to unusable in practice. To strangle Chinese oil imports you would have to stop tankers that are largely owned, flagged, insured, and crewed by third countries, and doing so would wreck the global economy the blockading power depends on. Insurance markets would seize. Asian economies that are American allies would be hit as hard as China. And Beijing could escalate horizontally in ways that make the cost unbearable long before the reserves run out. On this reading, Malacca is a theoretical vulnerability that no rational actor would ever exploit, which makes it strategically irrelevant. I take that seriously, and the economic interdependence point is correct. But I think it misreads what a vulnerability does. A choke point does not have to be closed to matter. It has to be closable. Planners do not get to assume the other side will behave rationally under maximum pressure, and they build for the case where it does not. That is why the SPR exists, why the Myanmar pipeline was built at 4% of imports, why the ESPO deal was signed on terms that favor the seller. China has spent enormous sums hedging against a scenario the counterargument says would never happen. Either Beijing is wasting that money, or Beijing does not share the confidence. I think the spending is the more reliable signal than the rhetoric, from either side. Three things follow if the vulnerability is real and only partly mitigated. First, it explains the intensity of Chinese interest in overland Eurasian supply, and it reframes the Russia relationship. Russian crude arriving by pipeline is not just cheap oil. It is the only large-volume supply that no navy can interdict. That makes it strategically worth more per barrel than its price implies, and it is a reason Beijing has leverage but also a reason it needs the relationship to hold. Second, it predicts continued heavy investment in blue water capability regardless of the diplomatic weather. This is not primarily about Taiwan. It is about the tanker route. Third, and this is the one I would watch, any project that materially increases non-maritime supply is worth more attention than its headline size suggests. A pipeline that moves 4% of imports is a rounding error economically and a meaningful hedge strategically. So the picture I would offer is a China that is genuinely powerful and genuinely constrained at the same time, and the constraint is geographic rather than economic or political. That combination tends to produce caution in the near term and enormous investment in escaping the constraint over the long term, which is more or less what the last 15 years look like. If you think the blockade is unusable argument is the stronger one, make that case in the comments. I have laid out why the hedging spending persuades me otherwise, and I would rather be argued out of it with evidence than agreed with. Next, what a serious attempt to escape Malacca would actually require, and why the Arctic route keeps coming up.